Welcome back. Well, the midweek marvels of political acumen have gathered to give us their take on housing, a trade deal in limbo, and pipelines. Let's get started. David Lametti is a Liberal Parliamentary Secretary. Candice Bergen, former housing minister of the Harper government, is the Conservative House leader. Rachel Blaney, the NDP for critic, and who put forward a bill on right to housing. That's why we're going to start with you today, Rachel. Good strategy, wish list, dreams, schemes, or do you think this is the way to go?
Well, first of all, it is disappointing in the sense of the right to housing. What we're seeing so far in this is they voted down the bill that I put forward about changing the Bill of Rights to add housing, which is a fundamental thing that so many housing advocates have been asking for so long. Knowing that governments change, policy change, but a right to housing, once it's in legislation, really creates a framework that will provide a stable housing strategy moving forward. So really disappointed that I see in this proposal that they're going to, again, consult about what the right to housing looks like. So right there was an opportunity to send it to committee to have a meaningful conversation.
What does the right to housing look like? Is it the right to pay rent you can't afford? What is it?
Well, what it is, and basically having the right to housing means that we have to look at how we're going to make sure that people are housed. What we've seen over the last 20 years, the NDP has been very clear, been asking for some sort of strategy, asking for some substantial funding for this, because what we've seen is a decrease again and again and again of housing funding, so that we can see that stability. And right now we have housing crisis, and it is not just an urban issue. This is a rural issue. I represent rural communities. You know, I had an employer call my office and say, we hired someone. It took us 8 months to get them here for the job. We held it open for them because they simply could find nowhere to live. So the housing crisis is right now, it's happening in Canada. It's very broad, the spectrum of people who are looking at housing needs. So the right to housing really means that the government has a responsibility to make sure that they're always a part of this conversation.
All right. Candice, the Conservatives had 10 years to do a housing strategy. They didn't. You were housing minister. Tisk, you could have done it. But is this a way to go? Or?
No, we actually always said a housing strategy, people don't need a group of people in Ottawa telling them how to fix the housing challenges. Different regions of the country have different challenges, different municipalities. There are different challenges facing the country. Now, the Liberals, with a lot of fanfare, have announced a housing strategy. You will note most of it doesn't come into effect until 2020 or later, which is so typical of the Liberals. A lot of shine and glitz over here, and usually no results, and usually, in fact, what they're trying to do, bombs in the end. So I think that there's a lot of things that can be done in terms of housing. Homelessness, for example, is a very different challenge than people who need more affordable housing. So their challenges, usually it's addiction and mental illness, people who are struggling with homelessness. We introduced and implemented something called Housing First, which has been a huge success. In fact, we talked a little bit about it 2 weeks ago, where we talked about the fact that veterans in the last 2 years, their homelessness percentage has gone through the roof, which is heartbreaking. So I think that there are a lot of solutions that can be had. I think certainly funding and letting provinces make decisions is a really important part of it. Municipalities and cities have a huge impact on the type of housing and what's available. But then helping people with addictions and mental illness is more the approach on homelessness.
So David, you got some critics. Why wait so long to really kick this thing into high gear? And why not declare the right to a home now? Why consult on it?
Well, Don, we effectively are implementing a program, a very good program that's based on effectively the right to housing. The UN Special Rapporteur came out today and said this is a huge step, a huge step. You just heard Kevin Page, who was generally favorable. It takes time. This is a massive program. It's a problem. We realize there's a real housing need in Canada, and we're going to fix it. We're committing $40 billion over 10 years. But it takes time to implement these things carefully, particularly because, as Candice states, we're going to work with the provinces, we're going to work with municipalities, and we're going to work with other groups, such as co-ops and that sort of thing, in order to get this right. And it also is tailored to be applied across the country, not just in urban settings, but in rural settings. We're talking not only about building social housing, 100,000 units that we'd like to see, but also increasing the stock and improving the stock of available housing. Again, fixing or bettering 300,000 properties across Canada.
I guess I'm curious one thing, if I could, on an ideological thing. Should the federal government be in the social housing business, or should it just give the money to
listen,
the...
Absolutely.
This is funny. So when we were in government, I remember Adam Vaughan and the Liberals criticizing us day after day after day for not renewing agreements on social housing.
Right.
These were agreements that had stopped being renewed under past Liberal governments and then current Conservative governments, because our belief was give the money to the provinces, let the provinces work with different housing providers. I noticed there's no announcement to renew the co-op, the social housing agreements after all the...
I think it's in there.
It's there. It's in
I've
there.
seen it.
Yeah,
It's in there.
no. So
It's in there.
now you're doing what we did, whereby the provinces can continue. So I know this.
Oh, okay.
Can continue
Yeah,
to
former housing
supplement.
minister.
We're giving money to continue the co-op.
You're not
There we are.
renewing the agreements.
Yeah.
Rachel,
You're renewing the
the money's
agreements.
there.
I think it's
You're not
really
renewing the
important to
agreements.
say what
You're not
we
renewing
heard
the
was
agreements.
$40 billion. That is not what this government is promising. What they're saying is they're going to work towards that with provinces and private. So let's just be really clear. The other reality is 90% of that funding isn't coming until after 2019, and there will be no report to Parliament until 2020. So, housing is a core need. This is a crisis across this country. It has been way too long. There's need for federal leadership, absolutely, because federal leadership is important because it's looking at the country as a whole and providing the information and then the funding to make sure that those houses are there. And so, what we're hoping to see is an actual partnership with provinces. We know that municipalities have been doing a lot of work on this front. A lot of those municipalities are ready. They're on the ground. They've been preparing for years, and they want to just get this going because the reality is they have everybody coming to their door saying, we desperately need home help.
I have to say, the Federation of Canadian Municipalities is in town today, and
Yes, they
they're
are.
pretty praising this.
Pretty
They're
happy.
praising
Look,
this thing. They're happy with this.
It takes time to implement these things, but it's also true that we've already started since we've been elected to put more money back into social housing. So it's not as if the money is starting to flow tomorrow.
Well,
we're back, and we do need federal leadership here. We have programs targeting.
It's a
targeting
crisis
all
to
sorts.
speak.
Don't say the child benefit.
Yeah.
That's,
I'm not going to say the child benefit, even though that's an
Listen,
important part of the picture. But,
I actually
we
think
have put money in.
Well, but and it's interesting. I met with FCM representatives today, and on things like infrastructure, they're still saying you've announced a lot of money. Where's the money? And I think there is a real legitimate concern around Liberals making announcements, but it actually not being delivered.
It takes time
and
to
I
deliver,
think,
and we're
well, when we were
delivering it
when we
very
were
clearly after the next
but
election is when
really,
it's gonna happen.
on infrastructure funding, we got the money directly
I'm
immediately
going to
to
get a little bell and
municipalities.
start
Well, good
banging
luck.
it,
Yeah.
okay? Or,
We'll need
okay.
the bell.
I do want to move on because I got a couple other topics. There's other things happening. The Business Council of Canada came out today. I thought it was kind of interesting. They are saying to the Trudeau government, look, don't lollygag around on the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which Trudeau didn't show up for a meeting to sort of sign off on an agreement in principle. We need this now. And I guess, Candace, I get your thoughts on this. How urgent is the TPP? Do we rush into it, or do we hold back and make sure we're getting the best deal? Or do you think we're getting the best deal?
Well, again, the devil is in the details. I know the deal that our government negotiated and worked on was a good deal. I'm hearing from sectors, agriculture, pork, different sectors that are primarily my riding, they want TPP. And I think there is some concern. We're not really understanding what the government's position, when you have a prime minister that doesn't show up for an important meeting, nobody really knows what happened. What's he holding back on? And I think the other message that we want to ensure the government is clear on is we need NAFTA and we need TPP.
Right.
It's not an either or, but these are important trade agreements that sectors are looking at in order to get access to more customers.
I think the NDP has some concern with TPP as it was originally presented. Are you supporting what Trudeau did and say, let's just hold back and...
Well, the concern here from both the Conservative government and the now current Liberal government is how much of this is being done in secret, and we don't know what's going to happen. We know a lot of experts have said up to 58,000 jobs could be lost across the country. There's a lot of sectors that are not feeling like they're included in the process because it is so secretive. And we know that when the committee went around Canada, about 90% of the people that came in there said, we're really against this, and we have a lot of serious concerns. So, we're hoping that those concerns will actually be addressed and that the secretiveness will be more open.
David, you've been very patient.
Don, you'll recall that I spent over a year as Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of International Trade, and I led consultations from coast to coast to coast on the TPP. I met with all sorts of stakeholders. And what we've done is taken quite a responsible approach. Yes, we heard the agricultural sector, beef, pork, and we know that they're strongly in favor of an agreement. But we also heard very serious reservations on the IP sections of the agreement, for example, and the fact that it wasn't green enough, it wasn't progressive enough. And that came out in our consultations across the country. I heard that so many times. So we took a very responsible approach to the new reality of the United States being out of the picture, and we have used that. We're at the table, we're continuing to negotiate, we're moving forward with an agreement that represents our values and obviously is trying to meet the needs of certain sectors that really would like to see the TPP, but also is true to our values. We're not going to sign any agreement, but we're working hard to get a good agreement at that table, to get the right agreement for Canada, and we're working hard at the NAFTA table too.
All right. Very quickly, Rachel Notley was in that chair yesterday saying the federal government has to do more to help push that pipeline through the Trans Mountain one through to the coast. Is the federal government falling down on the job, Candace?
100%. Their policy killed Energy East. There's absolutely no doubt about that. They have introduced regulations and very, very difficult competitive things that make Canada less competitive and make it not a smart idea at this point to build a pipeline. So, the Liberals have failed. They have not followed through on any commitment. In fact, the only thing that they've done when it comes to pipelines is made it more difficult and killed Energy East.
I don't suppose you want the federal government to get behind this pipeline more?
Well, you know, first of all, I just have to say how much I respect the work that Rachel Notley has done around climate change in her province.
NDP premier.
Well, and it's an important thing because I think the reason that we have so much concern around pipelines is specifically because we still have a government that's pushing through Harper's targets in terms of climate change. We've seen absolutely no change in that. All the experts are letting us know that we're not even going to meet those targets. Okay. So Canadians want to see some real action here. They're not seeing it. They have massive concerns, and that's why we're seeing. And it's still the same botched approach, right? It hasn't changed.
Brief answer.
We've had a responsible approach on pipelines that respects economic concerns and the environment. We established a set of criteria. We've approved pipelines under those criteria, like Trans Mountain, like Line 3. We've done far more on pipelines than the previous Conservative government did in 10 years.
Those are fighting words.
And we're going to keep moving.
Thank you all for coming in. We got through 3 topics.
We get along so well.
I know.
And then you start on pipelines.
You started right at the end. All right. Thank you all. We'll see you next week.